Telecommunications is one of those subjects that a lot of people find very boring and uninteresting, but I tell you what, it is one of the most interesting topics you can think of because if you really think about it, before the advent of telecommunications, you really didn't have any way to communicate with people outside of, the Pony Express or something like that. You had to find somebody in person. Just imagine the amount of business that has been able to be accomplished since the advent of the telecommunication system. So let's talk about that. All the way back in 1876 was when Alexander Graham Bell first introduced the telephone system. They used the telegraph before that, and then he based his system off of that. What was funny about that was Alexander Graham Bell, he answered the phone with ahoy, and he always thought that that should be the official greeting for somebody on the telephone, which I kind of like. I think it would be great if you'd pick up the phone instead of saying hello, you'd say ahoy. I always thought that'd be great. Now, over the years, since 1876, phone systems did not change very much. You've probably seen some old black and white movies and photos and stuff like that of the exchange people, and there would literally be usually women. It was considered to be like a secretarial type job would be in the exchange, and they would be unplugging phone lines and plugging them into the other lines, and everything was carried over copper wire, and it was done very analog and very manually. Literally unplugging your phone and plugging it into somebody else's phone, and it was through an exchange that way. That's the way that the system was originally developed, and that's the way it worked. Over time, a lot of computer technology was introduced to the telecommunication space in order to automate those types of things. So, for example, the dial tone system that we use today, computers would listen to those tones and be able to tell what numbers were being pressed. Before that, of course, you had the rotary phone, and the rotary phone would send electrical signals. So if you dialed number 9, then it would send 9 pulses, and that's how the computer would be able to tell what numbers were being input. Then they went to the touch tone phone, and the touch tone phone again used tones, and it was able to read those tones, and by using those tones, it was able to connect automatically to the right phone numbers. So those early computer systems were put in place to alleviate all that labor of plugging and unplugging systems, physically unplugging and plugging them, and instead replacing them with computers. And then as the technology got more complicated, of course, there were all kinds of research development done around the phone system. The phone system was driven so much by computer technology. The information field was largely developed based off of telecommunications with the Shannon information theory and some other information theories trying to figure out what's the difference between information versus just noise, how to isolate that kind of stuff. Once you isolated it, how to compress it, how to get it over phone lines, how to digitize it, things like that. So it was all a pretty interesting journey to look at. Early hackers hacked phone systems primarily because those early phone systems were your average person's only access to computer systems. Normal people outside of a university setting couldn't get their hands on computer systems, but they learned that the computers were operating the telecommunication system. So early hackers would create phreaking systems. It was called phreaking, spelled with a PH, that they were able to, so for example, make long distance calls because they determine, if you go to a payphone, you put in a quarter, then it makes a certain tone. Well, they found whistles, for example, that would make the same type of tone, and they'd be able to trick the computers into thinking that quarters were being inserted by doing that. Now, obviously, times have changed, things have evolved, and there's a handful of technologies that are out there now that have kind of evolved largely through the 90s and into the early 2000s. The PBX and SIP, POTS or POTS phones, and of course going into modern day, which is voice over IP or VoIP systems. So first of all, POTS phones, POTS is an acronym. It just stands for plain old telephone system. So that's what the POTS system is. It's just a standard telephone, goes out, is a phone that you would, put on, that was in your kitchen when you were a kid. It was the phone that was sitting there that you would make calls to. That's a POTS phone, plain old phone. Obviously, that doesn't work in a business environment. In business environments, you need to be able to have extensions, and you need different departments to be able to call each other. They don't want to burden the entire phone system. It'd be very expensive. For example, if you for everybody in your office to have their own phone number. Again, this is going back in time. This was the idea of like running a phone system, a telephone to every single person in your office was just completely out of the question. So what came along was the PBX system, which is the private branch exchange. The private branch exchange, or PBX phone, the whole idea behind that was to have private extensions. So you have basically a private phone system. That's the system that you're most used to today, which is the desk phone that you pick it up and you dial an extension, and that's actually somebody else's office. Then you're able to call and talk to that person. Or if you call into an office, a primary office, then you can talk to a specific person by knowing their extension. That's a PBX, or private branch exchange. So the idea is, instead of having, if you have 100 employees, instead of having everybody having 100 different phones, you just have maybe 4 or 5 phone lines. Everybody has a phone, but then the phone lines are directed as they come in privately. So obviously that's a lot cheaper than doing the everybody having their own phone line, which would be just outrageously expensive, right? So the POTS phones were replaced by the PBX phones, and then we get into SIP trunking, SIP. SIP is a protocol that was used to basically, it's called a session initiation protocol. And it was a protocol that, instead of connecting things analog, it was a digital, over the internet, over data line type of communication system. So, and it's a complicated protocol, but so instead of having to wire up phone systems together, it would use a data transit layer, basically, the internet, basically, though it doesn't have to be the internet. It would use a data transit layer to send those calls and information online and to communicate with different groups. Now, part of that, as that evolved, that also evolved into the VoIP system, voice over IP, which is what we have today, which is what most desktop phones are and most telephones in general. That's where you do voice over IP, IP being internet protocol. So it's basically the transport layer is the internet, and it's similar to the SIP system, but it's completely over the internet. So voice over IP. And again, it doesn't have to be over the internet. It can be through an intranet, but that's the way that system works. VoIP. And then we get into, so then as we're talking about telecommunications, then we start to get into, most people are thinking about the phone system and wires and all that kind of stuff. But now we're getting into the more modern stuff, things like Skype, Teams, Zoom, of course, your wireless phone. Everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket. What does all that stuff mean? Is all of that telecommunications? Is that something else? Is that something new? A lot of people kind of put that into the telecommunication bucket. And, when it comes to making phone calls and stuff, of course, you have virtual phones now. So you can have your desktop phone and somebody can call that number, and the number via voice over IP or VoIP, it can get forwarded to your direct phone, to your mobile phone. So rather than just ringing on your desktop, it'll ring on your phone. Again, is that telecommunications? I would say so. But what about people that are using something like Teams, where it rings on your desktop and it rings on your phone, and the whole thing is done through a transport layer? The whole thing is done through internet. Is that telecommunications? I think so. It's complicated, and there's a lot of information behind it. We have technicians that have been working on this stuff since the days of the early PBX, and even going back into the POTS phones, of course. And the original systems, the original PBX systems that were put in place in the 90s, we've got people with experience both in repairing those types of things and installing those types of things. And our technicians are top notch. They've seen it all and they've done it all. And of course, they're up to date on all the latest stuff. So if you need any help with your telecommunications, You make sure you contact Advantage Technology. We will help you out and we will move you forward.